Hello everyone, welcome to our channel that takes you on an exciting journey through real-life mysteries and stories solved in the most intriguing ways. If you're a fan of captivating narratives and tales that make you rethink the world around you, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to support us by liking and subscribing so you won't miss any of our new content. We're thrilled to share this special story with you today. Andrei Chikatilo, the serial killer who terrorized Russia. The full story of his brutal crimes. In the streets of Rostov, Russia, where silence fills the old neighborhoods and dark alleys, a monster lived among the people without anyone noticing. Andrei Chikatilo, whose name became synonymous with terror, hid in the shadows, carefully selecting his victims, leaving behind a series of unimaginable brutal crimes. He was no ordinary killer. He was a man with an extraordinary ability to infiltrate the heart of the city as if there was nothing that connected him to it. His story began in 1978 when he claimed his first victims on those deserted streets, and no one knew that an invisible crime had begun. For 12 years, he continued committing his crimes with precision and without mercy, leaving behind innocent bodies, devastated families, and a city living in constant fear. But like every crime that goes undiscovered in the dark, something had started to unravel. Over time, evidence began to accumulate, and the police uncovered hidden connections between the crimes, leading their suspicions toward one person. But even as the evidence grew, Chikatilo continued to evade them, hiding in the shadows, trying to escape the justice that was getting closer and closer. How would investigators manage to catch this cunning criminal? What method would reveal this monster, who had been hiding for so long in human form? This is the story of the pursuit of Andrei Chikatilo, the killer who terrorized an entire city. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yabloshchinka, near Rostov-on-Don in the Soviet Union. He grew up in harsh conditions, coming from a poor family. His father was a soldier in the Soviet Army during World War II, often absent for long periods due to his military service. His mother, on the other hand, was strict and harsh in her treatment of him, creating an unstable family environment for him. Chikatilo's childhood was difficult, as he suffered from numerous health problems. As a child, he contracted a severe fever that caused delays in his mental and physical development. He also suffered from malnutrition, which affected his overall health. These health struggles became part of his daily life, strengthening feelings of isolation and loss. Despite his childhood illnesses, his health issues were not the only reason he felt isolated. He was considered odd by his peers at school, where he faced bullying and ridicule due to his strange appearance and movements. He had trouble interacting with other children, which deepened his sense of loneliness and alienation. Chikatilo's relationship with his family was strained. His mother constantly made him feel guilty and ashamed of his health condition and physical weakness, while his father remained distant and largely absent from his life. During these times, no one in the family supported or built his self-confidence. He felt that there was no one to stand by him or care for him, which fostered feelings of anger and deprivation within him. Amid the emotional and physical suffering, Chikatilo struggled to find his place in the world. His childhood was filled with isolation and neglect from the surrounding society. All these factors combined to shape his personality in a way that would later contribute to the dark behaviors that surfaced in his later years. In his teenage years, Andrei Chikatilo's life became marked by more conflict and isolation. Having grown up in an environment filled with family tensions and health disturbances, he lacked any emotional or social support. At school, he continued to face bullying and had no close friends. He struggled to interact with others, whether at school or in society at large. His feelings of isolation deepened as he became more withdrawn and avoided social activities. He had no sports or artistic interests that could help him integrate with his peers. Despite his lack of social skills, Chikatilo excelled academically in some subjects, earning good grades at school, but he always felt alone. During his teenage years, some darker aspects of his personality began to emerge. Although he still struggled with social and emotional difficulties, he developed unhealthy tendencies toward violence. Some reports suggest that Chikatilo began engaging in negative behaviors like forced masturbation and looking at others in a strange way. These tendencies began to surface during his adolescence, where thoughts of power and control over others took root in his mind. During this period, Chikatilo also began developing other behaviors considered abnormal, such as abusing animals, which became an early sign of the aggressive and violent tendencies that would later evolve. For him, animals were easy victims upon which he could project his negative and controlling emotions. These years were highly complicated for him, as he faced internal conflicts regarding his identity and psychological tendencies. He did not fully understand the extent of the strange urges controlling him, but it was clear that these urges grew stronger over time. After his challenging teenage years filled with psychological struggles, Andrei Chikatilo entered adulthood under similar conditions of isolation and social withdrawal. In 1971, after completing his studies, he took a job as a teacher, but his life lacked any real social or emotional stability. He became known as an odd character, showing signs of aggression. Though he initially appeared to be an ordinary person on the surface, his deep-rooted impulses related to violence and control began to gradually surface. Between the 1970s and 1980s, the crimes committed by Chikatilo began to increase. He targeted vulnerable young girls and boys. At first, his crimes were isolated and small, but over time, they became more violent and complex. He assaulted his victims brutally and killed them in baffling ways, making it difficult to find a connection between the crimes. Initially, the police were unable to link the crimes, especially since Chikatilo displayed normal behavior in society. But as the number of victims increased and the brutal method of his killings became apparent, investigations began to reveal the connection between his actions and the crimes occurring in the Rostov region. Ultimately, he was arrested in 1990 after accumulating more and more evidence against him, revealing one of the most brutal crime sprees in Russian history. The first crime Andrei Chikatilo committed was in 1978. By this time, he had begun to feel his violent urges more acutely, living a life of isolation, far from any real social interaction. That year, Chikatilo lured a young girl named Ludmila, who was on her way home from school in Rostov. At first, he spoke to her normally, offering her help, then deceived her and took her to a secluded spot in the forest. There, he committed his first crime, assaulting her brutally and killing her. He used extreme violence, causing horrific injuries to the victim. He didn't stop there but repeated the same cruel actions with several later victims, including mutilating parts of their bodies in a savage manner. After committing the crime, he left the body where it was, partially covering the evidence. However, even though Chikatilo had started committing his crimes in such a brutal manner, the police initially failed to link this crime to any other in the area, allowing him to continue his killings for several years before being apprehended. This crime marked the beginning of a long series of brutal acts targeting victims of various ages, all linked by the same violent method of murder. On September 12, 1981, Chikatilo targeted a young girl named Lyubov Bereshinskaya, 17 years old. Lyubov was a quiet student known for her love of studying, and while waiting at a bus stop, she met Chikatilo, who was searching for a new victim. He managed to lure her into a secluded area near a river, using his usual methods of gaining trust, such as promises of assistance or something enticing. There, Chikatilo displayed his horrifying violence, assaulting her savagely and stabbing her several times with a knife. Investigations later showed that the stabbings were random and brutal, reflecting his escalating violence. After committing the crime, Chikatilo disposed of the body quickly and haphazardly, thinking the police would not link this crime to the previous ones. However, this was part of the beginning of a series of killings that lasted for years and caused great terror in the region. Although the police began to notice a pattern in the crimes, it took several years before they could arrest Chikatilo, due to the lack of evidence and the skill with which he covered his tracks. Here is the English translation of the text. The third crime of Andrei Chikatilo *. 2 months after committing his second crime, Andrei Chikatilo fell into another violent outburst, committing his third crime on December 11, 1981. This time, the victim was a 16-year-old girl named Larissa Tkachenko. Larissa was a known student at her school, admired for her kindness and love for music. On that day, Larissa was on her way home when Chikatilo approached her near a train station in the city of Shakti. As usual, he used his typical method of luring his victims, presenting himself as calm and friendly. He convinced her to accompany him to a nearby forest, claiming that he wanted to talk or offer assistance. Once they reached the isolated area, Chikatilo revealed his true nature. He attacked Larissa with unspeakable violence, physically assaulting her before using a knife to stab her repeatedly. Investigations later revealed that the crime was driven by a sick desire for control, with the stabbings being random and brutal, indicating an uncontrollable rage. After killing her, Chikatilo disposed of Larissa's body in the forest, attempting to hide the signs of the crime. Strangely, at the time, the police did not connect the crimes directly, as there was no effective system to track serial killers. Chikatilo continued to lead a double life, appearing normal to his family and colleagues while being a killer at heart. Larissa's crime was one of the first that started to reveal a certain pattern in his actions, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to stop him at the time. The fourth crime of Andrei Chikatilo, the girl who never came back. On the afternoon of June 3, 1982, the city of Rostov was peaceful under the gentle summer sun, but this day was about to witness one of the most horrific crimes committed by Andrei Chikatilo. In a neighborhood near a bus station, a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zaksanova was playing alone after her mother had promised to buy her a new toy. With her innocence and wide eyes, Lena had no idea that a human monster was watching her from a distance. Chikatilo, wandering in the area like a hunter looking for prey, spotted her and approached with a deceptive smile, presenting himself as a friendly man. He promised her candy and fun stories if she came with him. The child, unaware of the danger, followed him into a small forest area on the outskirts of the city, where the street noise faded among the silent trees. What happened in those moments in the forest was so horrific it is hard to describe. As soon as Lena was out of sight, Chikatilo attacked her like a predator. She tried to scream, but the forest was empty. He began stabbing her with his knife repeatedly, his violence escalating with each stab, as if trying to satisfy a sick, inner urge for control. Even after Lena died, he continued to mutilate her body in a way that showed his complete lack of humanity. The crime wasn't just a killing, it was an expression of a pathological urge that drove Chikatilo to enjoy tearing apart his victim's life. After finishing his crime, he buried the body haphazardly among the dry trees, then calmly rode the bus back home. That evening, he sat down for dinner with his family as though nothing had happened, while miles away, Lena's mother searched desperately for her missing daughter. This crime instilled fear in the hearts of Rostov's residents. Rumors began to spread about a killer stalking children, but the police lacked the evidence or knowledge to handle a serial killer. The fourth crime was not just an incident, it marked the beginning of a series of events that would prove that Chikatilo was not just a murderer, but a monster living among humans. The fifth crime of Andrei Chikatilo, the forest that won't silence its screams. In early August 1982, Andrei Chikatilo was wandering a small train station in the city of Shakti, appearing completely calm like any ordinary man in his late 40s. But deep within him, the volcano fueled by his dark passion was about to erupt again. On this ominous day, he spotted a young boy named Alexander Beryakov, 13 years old. Alexander was just a child who loved the simple life, roaming the city's neighborhoods and dreaming of a better future. Chikatilo approached him using his usual method, appearing calm and making deceptive promises. He convinced him that he would take him to a special place where he could get food and help, an offer that seemed attractive to a lonely and humble child. Chikatilo led the boy to an abandoned forest on the outskirts of the city, where the tall trees blocked the sun, creating a darkness like a locked room. There, amid the eerie silence of nature, Chikatilo revealed his true nature. He attacked Alexander with violent brutality that is hard to describe. He used his usual bloody method, stabbing him repeatedly with a knife. Every stab seemed to carry an unfathomable rage, as if it were a desperate attempt to feed a sick, insatiable desire. The child tried to resist, but his strength was no match for the beast attacking him. After taking his life, Chikatilo was not satisfied. He showed his sadistic tendencies by mutilating the body of the victim after death. Investigations later revealed that Alexander's body had undergone horrific abuse, indicating that the killer was not just looking for death but enjoying every moment of control. He quickly disposed of the body, hiding it among the dense forest. Then he returned to his daily life as if nothing had happened, fading from the scene and concealing his true face from the world. With this crime, investigators began to notice a recurring pattern in the brutal murders. However, the lack of forensic evidence and modern technology at the time made capturing this serial killer nearly impossible. Chikatilo, confident that his darkness remained hidden, continued his terrifying spree. The sixth crime of Andrei Chikatilo, the curse of the last train. On an evening in September 1982, the sky was dark with clouds, and the air was thick with the scent of impending rain. At a small train station on the outskirts of Shakti, Andrei Chikatilo was walking around like a wolf in a pack, pretending to be indifferent while observing everyone who passed by. His eyes were searching for the perfect victim, until they fell upon a little girl named Anna Lempideva, no older than 10 years old. Anna was an innocent child carrying a small bag on her back, waiting for the train to return to her nearby village. Her loneliness and vulnerability were exactly what Chikatilo needed to set his dark desires in motion. He approached her with a fake smile, using his usual method of offering assistance or pretending to know a better place for her. With a child's naive trust, Anna agreed to go with him. He led her to a deserted area near the railroad tracks, a place he knew well and which offered him the privacy he needed to carry out his crime. There, in the eerie silence of the place, he unleashed his violence. He attacked Anna with an unbelievable ferocity, pinning her down and starting to assault her viciously. He used his knife to stab her repeatedly, savoring the terror in her eyes. Each stab seemed to feed his inner demon that was never satisfied. What made this crime especially horrifying was how he handled Anna's body after killing her. Not only did he take her life, but he mutilated her body in a horrific manner, showing just how dark his soul had become and his complete detachment from humanity. He left her body out in the open by the railroad tracks, then left without a glance behind him. He returned home as though nothing sinister had occurred, while Anna's lifeless body would later haunt those who found it. This crime, like the others, added to the growing concerns about the serial killer, but the lack of forensic evidence at the time and the inability of investigators to connect the scattered crimes allowed Chikatilo to continue his brutal acts with no fear or remorse. For him, each crime was a deeper descent into the darkness that had taken over his life, and each victim was merely a means to satisfy a monster that could not be stopped. The seventh crime of Andrei Chikatilo, death in the depths of the field. On a cold autumn day in November 1982, as winds blew through the open fields around the city of Shakti, Andrei Chikatilo wandered, his eyes scanning the area for a new victim to fuel his growing evil. He appeared as if he were a lost man looking for direction, but his true destination was the darkness within him. On this day, his eyes fell upon a young boy named Sergei Kuzmin, just 15 years old. Sergei worked as a small assistant in the local market, helping people carry goods to earn some money. Chikatilo met the boy at a bus station, where Sergei was waiting for a ride back to his nearby village. Chikatilo approached with his usual calm smile and offered to help him with some money in exchange for accompanying him to a nearby place to fetch some goods. Sergei, trusting the friendly-looking man, agreed without hesitation. He had no idea that this trip would be his last. Chikatilo led the boy to an abandoned field on the outskirts of the city, a secluded place where no one could hear the screams. There, without warning, his face transformed from calm to pure brutality. He seized his knife and attacked Sergei. He began stabbing him in various parts of his body, using his usual violent force as though each strike was an expression of his inner rage. Sergei tried to resist, but his strength was no match for the eighth crime of Andrei Chikatilo, the child swallowed by shadows ****. On a bitterly cold winter morning in December 1982, snow covered the streets of Shakti, and people hurried to their homes to escape the freezing cold. Amid this peaceful scene, Andrei Chikatilo moved like a hunter searching for a new prey, pretending to be an ordinary man going about his business. On that day, he chose a young boy named Igor Galiev, who was just 9 years old. Igor was returning home from school, alone, carrying his small school bag and walking quickly along the snow-covered streets. Chikatilo approached him with a smile full of deceit and began speaking to him kindly, using his usual method to lure victims. He offered him a piece of candy and told him he knew a shortcut to get him home faster, away from the cold. Igor, with the innocence of a child that knew no danger, agreed to accompany him. Chikatilo led the boy to a secluded area in a nearby forest, where tall trees blocked the pale sunlight, making the place eerily quiet and intimidating. There, suddenly, his calm face turned into a mask of absolute brutality. Chikatilo grabbed the boy violently and began attacking him with unprecedented savagery. Igor resisted with all his might, screamed, cried, but his cries melted into the cold silence of the eerie forest. Chikatilo used a knife to deliver repeated stabs to the child's body, each blow more violent than the last. After taking the boy's life, he began his sadistic rituals. He mutilated the body in a horrifying manner, as if violence itself was his final goal. He left the body in the forest, covered by snow, and walked away as though nothing had happened. Back at home, Chikatilo calmly sat with his family, pretending to be an ordinary man, while the traces of his bloody crime still haunted the place he had left behind. Igor's body was later discovered, and investigators were shocked by the brutality of the attack. But, as usual, there was not enough evidence to link this crime to Chikatilo, allowing him to continue his journey in darkness. With every crime, Chikatilo grew bolder, believing that he was beyond suspicion and could escape justice forever. But his increasing brutality began to leave traces that might one day lead to his end. The ninth crime of Andrei Chikatilo: endless torments in the dark. On February 22, 1983, Andrei Chikatilo moved through the city of Rostov, making the darkness his preferred path. The snow had melted due to heavy rains, and the ground was filled with mud that absorbed his heavy steps. His mind was preoccupied, as it always was, with finding a new victim to satisfy his sick hunger. On that day, there was Dmitry Taranov, a 17-year-old young man. Dmitry was walking quickly back home after a long day at work, carrying his heavy bag on his back. He, too, was alone, like many of Chikatilo's victims. He was lost in his thoughts, unaware that this moment would be his last. Chikatilo, skilled in the art of feigning kindness, approached him and began talking. He told Dmitry that he knew a good shortcut to save time and effort. Dmitry, seeing no danger in this calm man, agreed to accompany him. Chikatilo led the young man to a remote area, on the outskirts of the city, where fields and marshes lay deserted. The area was eerily isolated, the perfect place for a crime. There, beneath the dark cover of the forest, Chikatilo revealed his true nature. He grabbed Dmitry violently and began attacking him with a knife, stabbing him repeatedly. The young man tried to resist, but Chikatilo's superior strength was more than any resistance. Dmitry screamed with all his might, but his voice disappeared in the wind, unheard by anyone. After knocking him to the ground, Chikatilo continued torturing him until he took his life, then mutilated his body in gruesome ways, just as he had with all his previous victims. It seemed as if he consumed every part of his victim's body, trying to assert complete control over their tormented soul. Then, as always, he disposed of the body in a remote spot amidst nature, leaving it to merge with the earth and mud that absorbed it. He returned to the city as though nothing had happened. Although the police still lacked evidence to connect the crimes, the investigations began to intensify. Over time, investigators began noticing a pattern in these crimes that Chikatilo thought he could hide. But at that moment, he believed time was on his side, even as the end grew nearer. The 10th crime of Andrei Chikatilo: the final trap in the abandoned farm. Spring had arrived in May 1983, and despite the warmth of the days, the sky was signaling an approaching storm. Andrei Chikatilo wandered through a dark neighborhood in Rostov, feeling an increasing sense of hunger deep inside him. It seemed as though something inside him was pushing him to search for a new victim, to satisfy his insatiable craving. That day, he chose Nikolai Trigub, a 17-year-old young man who was returning home after a day of work on a nearby farm. Nikolai was strong, but he, too, was alone, like many of Chikatilo's victims, carrying the innocence of youth in a world dominated by darkness. Chikatilo approached him with a false smile and told him he knew a shortcut to get back to his home through an abandoned farm nearby. The offer seemed appealing to Nikolai, who did not suspect any danger from this strange man. Little did he know, he was walking into a trap that would lead to his death. Chikatilo led Nikolai to the abandoned farm, situated in a secluded area far from prying eyes. The surrounding trees made it look like an isolated place, perfect for committing a crime. Inside the farm, the sound disappeared, and nothing but the howling wind filled the air, making the atmosphere even more foreboding. At one point, as Nikolai followed Chikatilo into the farm, the man revealed his true nature. He attacked the young man swiftly, grabbing him violently and then stabbing him with his knife, alternating between random strikes and calculated sadistic precision. Nikolai tried to escape or resist, but Chikatilo's iron grip was stronger than any resistance. The stabs kept coming, and the young man's body scattered across the muddy ground. Nikolai's screams filled the air, but the wind swallowed them, leaving him lost in time and space. After Nikolai fell motionless, Chikatilo began mutilating his body in a brutal manner, just as he had done with his previous victims. He didn't just kill him, he enjoyed torturing him after death, leaving his body in the time and place where this horrific crime occurred. Then, he left the scene quietly, returning to his life as though nothing had happened. Little did he know, this crime would be the last step toward his tragic end. The police began intensifying their efforts to investigate the increasing crimes in the area, but no one suspected that the monster walking among them had grown bolder and more powerful. Chikatilo thought he was safe from justice, but the days were drawing closer to his eventual exposure. The 11th crime of Andrei Chikatilo, the victim of eternal darkness. On a dark night in August 1983, the city was unusually quiet. The fierce winds sweeping through the streets of Rostov carried a sense of mystery, as if hiding an ominous warning. In those moments, Andrei Chikatilo moved through the dark streets, watching passers-by with his restless eyes, as if searching for something, or rather, someone. This time, his choice was Viktor Alexeyev, a 22-year-old young man living a simple, modest life. Viktor was walking home after a long day at work, alone in the dark street. He had no idea that these steps would be his last. Chikatilo approached him calmly, beginning a conversation with his soothing, reassuring manner. He told him that he knew a nearby place where they could grab a bite to eat, a tempting offer for Viktor, who was exhausted. He didn't suspect any danger from this man who seemed kind. Chikatilo led Viktor through narrow streets to a remote area outside the city, where everything vanished under the cover of darkness. There were swamps and uninhabited lands where no one could hear the cries of a victim, and it was the perfect place to commit his crime. As they entered this secluded place, Chikatilo revealed his true nature. He shocked Viktor by attacking him violently, stabbing him with his knife in an unbelievable frenzy. Viktor tried to escape or defend himself, but Chikatilo was much faster and stronger. The stabs kept coming, each one adding to the pain and injuries. At that moment, Viktor surrendered to fate, but Chikatilo was not finished. As always, he mutilated the body after death, showing his increasing sadism and desire to have complete control over his victims. He carried out his crime as though it were a ritual that needed to be completed perfectly. Then, as he had come, he disappeared. He left Victor's body exposed, covered by darkness, with no one knowing what had happened except the desolate place that witnessed the crime. Chikatilo returned to his everyday life, pretending nothing had happened. But this didn't last long. The crime began to raise concern among investigators, and they started to connect the growing number. The 12th crime of Andrei Chikatilo, his remote village and the murdered ghost. In November 1983, while the cold winds filled the streets of Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo moved through the neighborhoods like any ordinary person. He felt something strange inside him, as though his need to kill had become more urgent. The crimes he committed were growing bolder and more violent. During this time, Chikatilo was known for his ability to hide his demons behind a calm face, as though the lives he had taken had never affected him. On that day, he chose Sergei Mikhailov, a 15-year-old boy who was wandering through a remote area away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Sergei was on his way to his grandfather's house in a village near Rostov, walking alone along a long road, surrounded by farmland. At first, Chikatilo approached him simply, like an old man offering help. He told Sergei that he knew the road well and could guide him to his destination faster. Sergei, kind-hearted and simple in thought, didn't see any threat in the man's words and decided to accompany him. Chikatilo led Sergei along a winding path that led to a secluded spot on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by vast farmland. The atmosphere was quiet, but the calmness concealed something dark. Chikatilo walked with confidence, his eyes filled with hunger and malice. They reached a completely isolated area, surrounded by large wheat fields. As Sergei looked around, Chikatilo attacked. Suddenly, he grabbed him from behind and shoved him to the ground. Sergei tried to escape or scream, but Chikatilo's grip was too strong, rendering him unable to resist. Chikatilo began stabbing him brutally, aiming for his chest and abdomen, while the young boy screamed and fought bravely, but to no avail. After Sergei fell motionless, Chikatilo didn't stop. He began mutilating the body viciously, as he had done with all his victims. He reveled in destroying the body in a way that reflected his growing sadism. His knife darted in every direction, as if each strike was an expression of his inner madness. Once he was done, he left Sergei's corpse lying in the field, disappearing among the tall hills, as though everything had happened in the darkness. The police were unable to easily connect this crime to the previous ones. There were no witnesses, and the location was far from the public eye. As before, Chikatilo believed he had escaped justice once again. However, over time, the evidence began to accumulate, and the police started suspecting that a serial killer was committing his crimes in complete silence. This crime was another in the series of brutal murders committed by Chikatilo, and with each victim, he grew closer to his inevitable end. Investigations began to uncover links that pointed to one place, Andrei Chikatilo. The 13th crime of Andrei Chikatilo, hunting in the darkness. On a cold winter night in January 1984, the winds howled through the streets of Rostov. Yet, Andrei Chikatilo wandered aimlessly, but deep inside, he knew exactly what he wanted. His dark hunger grew with time, and he thirsted for another kill. He chose his victims carefully, watching them from afar, then closing in to snatch them at the right moment. On this day, he chose Alexander Kuznetsov, a 17-year-old young man. Alexander was returning home from visiting a relative in a neighboring town. He was walking alone along the dark road, hurrying to get home before the cold became unbearable. Little did he know, these steps would be his last. Chikatilo, who had been watching the young man from a distance, approached him cautiously, pretending to be friendly. He offered to help him carry his bag and told him he knew a faster way to get where he was going. Alexander, like many of Chikatilo's previous victims, didn't suspect the man's friendly demeanor and felt no danger. He agreed to accompany him. Chikatilo led him to the edge of a nearby forest, where dense trees blocked the light, making the area even darker and more terrifying. The silence was so absolute it felt as though time had stopped. When they reached the depths of the forest, where no one could hear a sound, Chikatilo suddenly attacked without mercy. He grabbed Alexander from behind, pinched his ear, and whispered incomprehensible words. Then, in a moment of sudden violence, he shoved him to the ground and began stabbing him with his knife. He attacked his body violently, aiming for the most vital areas, each stab taking a part of his soul. Alexander tried to scream, but he knew he was in the wrong place with the wrong person. His resistance was futile against Chikatilo's destructive strength. When he brought him down, Chikatilo began mutilating the body in a horrifying way, as he had done with his previous victims. He carefully and ruthlessly cut parts of the young man's body, as if it were all part of his dark ritual. After finishing his crime, he left Alexander's body lying on the ground, hidden among the dark trees, where no one could hear it or realize that another soul had been taken. He then returned to his normal life, going back to his home as if nothing had happened, while the police were submerged in investigations that led nowhere. But this crime, like all his others, was not only a sign of his increasing sadism but also another step closer to his inevitable end. With each new victim, Andrei Chikatilo grew closer to the moment his identity would be revealed, but at the time, he believed his skill in evading capture would grant him eternal darkness. The 14th crime of Andrei Chikatilo, the last trap in complete darkness. In the summer of 1984, the weather in Rostov was unbearably hot, and the city was sweltering under unusually high temperatures. The sky was filled with thick clouds, and everything around Andrei Chikatilo evoked a strange feeling inside him. He felt his growing need to kill, as if the darkness enveloping the city had become a part of his being. As time passed, his crimes became more sadistic, and he believed it was time to hunt his new prey. This time, he chose Viktor Solodov, a 19-year-old young man. Viktor was strong and tall, heading to the train station to return to his hometown after spending some time in the city. Chikatilo's hidden eyes closely monitored his movements until he felt it was the perfect moment. He approached Victor, smiling with a hidden grin that concealed his malice. He began talking to him about life in the city and the opportunities the young man might find elsewhere, then offered to escort him to the train station faster. Victor didn't suspect the elderly man, thinking his intentions were harmless. He agreed to accompany him. Chikatilo led Victor down a dark, winding road that led to an isolated field on the outskirts of the city. The area was completely devoid of any movement or light, making it the ideal place for his horrific crime. As they walked together in the desolate place, Chikatilo felt an inner excitement, knowing he was about to commit another brutal act to add to his grim record. While Victor was talking to Chikatilo, the latter surprised him with a swift movement, grabbing him from behind with great force. The young man tried to resist the attack, but Chikatilo's grip was too tight. He shoved him to the ground and began stabbing him violently with all his might, the knife tearing through Victor's soft flesh. The struggle was fierce, with Victor screaming for help, but he didn't have enough strength to escape or even scream loud enough for someone to hear. As with his previous victims, Chikatilo began mutilating the body, enjoying each moment of this destructive process. His hands moved quickly across the body, savoring what he saw before him. Each step revealed the depth of his mental illness and his twisted enjoyment of his victim's pain. After completing his crime, Chikatilo left Victor's body lying in the darkness, where there were no witnesses to what had happened. He then quickly moved away from the scene, as if nothing had occurred. Little did he know, investigations had started to focus more closely on him. Over time, he believed he would always escape justice, but he was getting closer to the moment of truth. This crime, like all the others in his series of brutal murders, was another step towards the inevitable end he couldn't escape. The 15th crime of Andrei Chikatilo, murder under the moonlight. In the spring of 1985, the atmosphere in the city of Rostov began to change. The sky, once filled with heavy clouds, gradually began to clear. However, for Andrei Chikatilo, the weather had no effect on his motives. Those days were filled with isolation and psychological pressure for him, and with each passing day, his urgent need for another kill grew, seeking vengeance for the darkness of his inner world. His demons controlled him more than ever. On this night, he chose Oleg Yurchenko, a young man in his 20s. Oleg had decided to spend the evening walking around the city after a long day at work. The sun had set, and the night sky had emerged, with streetlights flickering intermittently. Oleg seemed unaware of the danger lurking, walking confidently toward a cafe to meet his friends. But that night would be different from all others. Suddenly, Chikatilo appeared before him. An elderly man with a light beard and simple clothes. He approached Oleg with a friendly smile and began talking to him about nearby places in the city that Oleg might enjoy visiting. The words seemed harmless, and no one could have predicted that the smile was merely a mask concealing a deadly intent. Chikatilo offered to take Oleg to a nearby quiet spot, away from the noise of the city. Without feeling any danger, Oleg agreed to accompany him. The two began walking together down a quiet path, away from prying eyes, the air thick with a strange calm, while shadows danced beneath the moonlight. As they walked deeper into the dark path, Chikatilo began to feel something strange, as if the storm inside him was intensifying. When they reached a point surrounded by trees, he suddenly transformed into the monster he had been hiding inside all along. In a swift moment, he grabbed Oleg and shoved him to the ground, stabbing him quickly in the heart and abdomen. Oleg fought back, but he was under Chikatilo's iron grip, unable to escape. As Oleg's screams barely escaped his throat, Chikatilo focused on his gruesome work, relishing every moment as though each stab represented a release of his inner torment. Once Oleg had fallen unconscious, Chikatilo began to slowly and precisely mutilate his body, never ceasing to enjoy the destruction of the human form before him. His hands carefully tore at the parts of Oleg's body with no mercy, as though this crime was part of some dark ritual. He left Oleg's body in that desolate spot, hidden under the thick shadows of the trees, the moonlight barely illuminating the scene. There was no trace of the crime, as the darkness concealed the truth. Chikatilo then walked away as if nothing had happened, returning to his daily routine. However, over time, the police gathered evidence, and the elusive serial killer, who had repeatedly evaded capture, was drawing closer to being caught. Oleg's murder would become one of the unsolved mysteries that would continue to haunt Chikatilo, one of the final crimes he committed before justice finally caught up with him. The 16th crime of Andrei Chikatilo. On November 6, 1987, Andrei Chikatilo claimed his 16th victim, a young man named Nikolai, who was 17 years old. Nikolai was on his way to the train station after a long day at school, walking through the dark alleys of Rostov. Night had fallen quickly, and the city was quiet, disturbed only by the cold wind. As Nikolai walked through an abandoned alley, he felt the presence of someone following him. He turned around and saw an elderly man, looking weak, with a strange look in his eyes, but he didn't think much of it. He assumed the man might need help. Chikatilo approached him and, taking advantage of Nikolai's kindness, asked him to accompany him to a nearby location. Nikolai, unaware of the imminent danger, agreed. Chikatilo, who had planned everything carefully, led the young man to a deserted area, where the lights were dim and the streets empty. At that moment, everything changed. With swift movement, Chikatilo attacked Nikolai. The young man fell to the ground, desperately trying to escape, but Chikatilo's iron grip was too strong to break. There was no place to flee, and no one to help. Chikatilo, who had always relished his solitude, found satisfaction in that moment. He began to carry out his monstrous act with precision and brutality, stabbing the victim's heart mercilessly. As Nikolai's body lay in pieces, blood staining the ground, Chikatilo didn't stop. He destroyed everything in front of him to satiate his savage desires. After completing his crime, Chikatilo left Nikolai's body in the deserted alley and disappeared back into the darkness. The 16th murder was one of his most brutal, leaving behind a new victim and a chilling silence in a city still unaware of the identity of the killer. Nikolai's body was found several days later, and the crime shocked the city. With each murder, the investigations intensified, but without success. Chikatilo had learned how to disappear, leaving behind a trail of chaos with no clear evidence. The revelation of Andrei Chikatilo. The revelation of Andrei Chikatilo's identity came after years of intensive investigations and an ongoing manhunt by Russian authorities, who gradually began to link the crimes based on a common pattern. Although Chikatilo had committed dozens of murders over the years, his capture was not easy. The evidence that led to Chikatilo's identification began to emerge after several years of crimes. Below are the key pieces of evidence that helped in identifying him. Biological traces at crime scenes. After many murders, the police began collecting biological evidence from crime scenes. The most notable was semen found on several victims, indicating a consistent pattern in the killer's actions. Fingerprint evidence on victims. In some cases, fingerprints were found, suggesting the killer had been at the crime scenes, though they weren't immediately identifiable. Witness testimonies. Some witnesses reported seeing a suspicious individual at the crime locations, especially in the remote areas where Chikatilo operated. Investigations in public places. Chikatilo was linked to several locations where victims were found, as he lived in the same area and, in some cases, was present in or near the crime scenes at similar times. DNA match. The breakthrough came when DNA samples were taken from Chikatilo and compared to the biological samples found on the victims. The result was a match between Chikatilo's DNA and the semen found on the victims, confirming he was the killer. These interconnected pieces of evidence were crucial in identifying and capturing Chikatilo in 1990, leading to his connection with the string of murders he had committed. The pursuit of Andrei Chikatilo and his eventual arrest came after years of meticulous investigations, involving many detectives. The efforts to understand the pattern of his crimes and find a link between the scattered evidence at the crime scenes were key to identifying him. In 1989, investigations accelerated as several killings, involving both children and young adults, were linked. Investigators noted that the crimes occurred in remote areas of Rostov and surrounding regions, with the killer targeting people walking alone at night before attacking them in secluded areas. What truly raised suspicions about Chikatilo was his strange behavior and repeated presence in areas where the crimes occurred. By late 1989, police had begun to focus on analyzing the DNA left at crime scenes, and it became clear that one person was responsible for multiple murders. As investigative techniques improved, biological evidence collected from the victims, such as hair and tissue samples, was compared to DNA from a group of suspects. In December 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was identified as the prime suspect. His increasingly suspicious behavior, combined with the fact that he lived in the same areas where many of the crimes took place, led investigators to focus on him. On November 20, 1990, Chikatilo was placed under surveillance by a team of investigators. This was the first time he was closely monitored. On the day he was arrested, Chikatilo was involved in a minor traffic incident when he was pulled over by police for suspicious driving. During the stop, a thorough search was conducted on him and his car. At this moment, investigators realized they were very close to capturing him. Chikatilo was taken to the police station, where he was intensively interrogated. At first, Chikatilo denied any involvement in the murders, but the evidence collected from the crime scenes pointed